So just to start, there's not much money in mindfulness training. As you all know, there's no money in research either, so we should really write our Congress people. And I'm joking, but I'm not joking, because until we actually talk to our Congress people, we won't get more money at NIH. Yale spun off a company from some of our neuroscience work, working with social entrepreneurs to bring it into the public. I won't talk about any of that stuff today. But where I will start is with a cognitive model, just as a framework, a heuristic framework that's helpful for us to think about where we're working with the problem. So I'm sure all of you are familiar with positive and negative reinforcement, so I won't go through all the details, but you can just think of a positive cue leading to positive affect. There's an urge to keep that positive affect going, just using examples of smoking or eating because there's good data in both of those realms, as well as many other addictions. We do a behavior that reinforces this, gets laid down as a memory, leading to positive or negative reinforcement and increased salience. So this has been published all the way back to 1898, I think was the first paper that I found. Very, very good data around this, and a simple model. Now it's interesting, when you look at this model, one other thing I'll mention about this is that there's an affective bias that gets established through this increased salience network. Now, it's interesting that a Buddhist psychologist actually described a very similar process 2,500 years ago, and the way they described it was that the mind evaluated input, whether it was external or even internal through thinking, as pleasant or unpleasant, and that these both led to craving, again, craving for the pleasant to continue and craving for the unpleasant to go away, leading to a behavior. The way they described this was then there was a birth of a self-identity. They didn't really have neuroimaging facilities back then, so couldn't look at working memory and things like that, but they described this as the birth of a self-identity and things centered around me. Now, the other thing that they described was that this process was perpetuated by what they described as ignorance. But this also, I think, links up very nicely with the way that we think of cognitive or affective bias. The more we see some things a certain way, the more we're likely to see them that way through these lenses in the future. The last thing I'll mention here is that they describe this loop in a process called samsara, which the literal translation of which is endless wandering. Because as we try to make things better or make things good or less bad, we just dig in our heels or spin our wheels and get stuck. So what about mindfulness? So mindfulness is very popular these days. Probably everybody here is sophisticated enough to not think of this as holding hands and singing Kumbaya. But I think there's a lot of misinformation around what mindfulness actually does. So just in case you haven't heard, it's not holding hands and singing Kumbaya. Now, what is it exactly? Jon Kabat-Zinn, I guess that's PC for John Kabat-Zinn, translated from my Mac. So this will be interesting. He used a simple definition of paying attention in the present moment on purpose, non-judgmentally. And I think mindfulness is, we've heard a lot about paying attention, and I think there are different domains of attention like Bruce was talking about. So I think there's a particular aspect that I'm going to drill into a little bit more today, and we'll get into that. So what are we talking about in terms of paying attention? One way that we can think of this is, and I'll just use an example from our clinic. When we did a clinical study with smokers, we have them smoke a cigarette mindfully. So for anybody that's gone through a mindfulness training, there's this famous raisin exercise where you eat a raisin. You look at it, and you listen to it, you smell it, and you eat it slowly, and suddenly you realize, wow, that's what a raisin tastes like. Well, we do the same thing with smokers, and they realize, wow, that's what a cigarette tastes like. It tastes like shit. Here's an example. Smells like stinky cheese and tastes like chemicals. Yuck. Now, I highlight this because there's a difference between this type of learning and cognitive behavioral therapy. And I think both I'm just going to highlight that they're different, and both can be effective in very different ways. But this this suggests that there's more of a bottom-up rather than a top-down type of process going on, because they're not training themselves to do anything. They're just paying attention and seeing what they're actually getting from their behavior. Yuck. So I'm not going to go through the details of this. Oh, So this is Yogi Berra, and I think he actually did say this. But I think this is interesting. You can observe a lot just by watching, and he's kind of getting it at what John Kabat-Zinn was also talking about. I'm not going to go into the details of this because I'm going to talk more about neuromechanisms, and thank you to Sarah and Tammy for helping me stay focused on this. Just to say that we can get very good effects with mindfulness training comparing it to good cognitive therapies. And it's interesting, I'm just going to highlight a piece here around craving, because it's not, at least in the studies that we've done so far, we can see a strong correlation between craving and cigarette use at baseline that goes completely away at the end of training. And it's not because of their baseline craving, cigarette use, or even end of treatment craving. When we look at moderators of this effect, it's actually informal mindfulness practice itself. So it's not necessarily a change in the craving that actually helps people quit smoking. It's about a change in the relationship to craving. If you look at the raw data, you can actually see this. You can see there's no difference in craving at the end of treatment for people who quit smoking and people who don't quit smoking. But over time, as people have stopped, I think of it as adding fuel to that fire of craving, that fire burns down on its own. And that may be, again, a different process than with cognitive behavioral therapy. So if you look at this model again, there are a lot of treatments that help people avoid cues, provide substitute behaviors. It suggests that mindfulness is actually mechanistically, from a psychological standpoint, acting here to moderate the decoupling of craving and smoking. So if we look now to the brain, what's actually going on in brain regions that are involved in reinforcement of behavior? So I'm not going to talk about dopaminergic systems. Hedy will probably talk about that tomorrow. Other folks are much better and much more sophisticated and knowledgeable than I am. I'm going to approach this from just kind of one prototype example of a brain region that seems to have fallen out of the literature and some of the data that we've gotten, that may be a kind of a foot in the door to looking at networks and interactions of networks related to this. So I'm going to present one simplistic view here that might start to shed light and provide a workable, testable hypotheses that can be further explored. So just looking at some of the literature, Hugh Garavan did a study over about 15 years ago where they found that the posterior cingulate cortex, among other brain regions, gets activated when cocaine-dependent individuals are watching cocaine videos. Another more recent study showing that when people are resisting, cigarette smokers are resisting cravings, you can see this characteristic default mode network activation pattern, but you can see when they even compare it to accepting their cravings, you can see that the posterior cingulate, again, is increased in activity compared to the accept condition. And also a more recent study found that the connectivity pattern between the parahippocampal areas and the posterior cingulate cortex can actually predict the likelihood that somebody's going to relapse to cocaine use as compared to folks that are remitted or control conditions. So we're starting to see a pattern here emerge with the posterior cingulate being a central player here. This is just a case study. I'm not going to say much more about that, but here was a case study where somebody with a posterior cingulate stroke had a spontaneous smoking cessation. So I'm just going to let you read through this because there's now a ton of literature and a lot of it coming together in a certain way. So all of these studies I'm just going to list here, and you can read them yourselves, relate to increased activity in the posterior cingulate cortex. So there's a lot out there, and of course, most related to us is craving, okay? So how do we make sense of all of this? So one hypothesis that that we can start testing is, if we think about this, and this is work that I did with Sue Whitfield-Gabrielli, so John's wife, one hypothesis that we can put forward is, what, in terms of Occam's razor, what do all of those studies in that previous slide that I showed you share in common? And is this an idea of kind of getting caught up in experience? It's not necessarily the craving or the whatever else, but it's the getting caught up in it or following it along. And I'm sure you all can see how this relates to addiction, because you can have a craving or you can get lost in your craving or caught up in your craving, and those are very different. just like we saw with the smoking study. So the hypothesis is, well, if we're getting caught up in stuff, does mindfulness training actually help us get out of our own way, or don't get caught up in whatever it is? And a lot of these, I don't have time to show it, but there's some great studies showing that you can actually, that when you give people an opportunity to talk about themselves, they will take that opportunity and talk about themselves, and that corresponds with nucleus accumbens activation. And this may relate to why Facebook is so popular, because it's, we get addicted to our own selves even, or talking about ourselves. So we did a study a couple of years ago. This was a study it's great to be here with my mentors from Yale, Mark and Kathy, and Hetty and I did this study with some others a couple of years ago, where we simply took experienced and novice meditators in a cross-sectional experiment and had them do 3 different types of meditation, and looked at a conjoint analysis to see among those 3 were there common brain regions that were activated or deactivated. And the short answer here is we see here these 2 main hubs of the default mode network, the medial prefrontal cortex and especially the posterior cingulate cortex, shown here in blue, meaning that experienced meditators show relatively less activation compared to novices. We recently replicated this study in a larger sample and extended it to active baseline tasks and found the same thing. When we go and do a functional connectivity analysis, using the posterior cingulate as a seed region, it's really interesting that what we find. And when you look at experienced meditators versus controls, this white bar here is the baseline condition, which is just resting state. So lay still, don't do anything in particular. You can see the characteristic anti-correlation pattern between the posterior cingulate and the dorsal anterior cingulate, which is involved in, depends on who you are and how you want to say it, but you can think of it as self-monitoring or conflict monitoring. You can see here at baseline, the experienced meditators show an increased coupling, functional connectivity pattern, and also that's very similar to the 3 meditations that we perform. So it seems that these functional connectivity patterns are different between experienced meditators and controls, between the dorsal anterior cingulate and the posterior cingulate, even at baseline. It gets more interesting when you look at regions that are thought to be involved in cognitive control or working memory, such as the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. Again, you can see the characteristic anti-correlation pattern in controls at baseline, but when you look during the meditation condition, there's no difference between the groups. And it's not because the meditators are showing big differences in their functional connectivity, it's actually because the controls are looking more like meditators, moving more in the direction of the experienced meditators. So these were, so Richard actually doesn't show up in PC speak. So Richard Feynman suggested that science is a way of trying not to fool yourself. So we turned to one of my colleagues at Yale, Zenius Papademetris, and he had developed, in conjunction with some others at other labs, a real-time neurofeedback technology. And we use this to employ, just to try to confirm our findings, where now that we have a region of interest to go after, we can give people active feedback while they're meditating. We can do a bunch of control experiments. I won't go through those today for interest of time. And what this looks like is we have people lay in the scanner with their eyes open, meditating, and from time to time check in with the graph to see if it's correlating with their subjective experience. And every 2 seconds, the TR is 2 seconds here, so we can graphically display increases or decreases in the posterior cingulate activity relative to a baseline. In this case, we used an adjective baseline, a trait adjective baseline, to try to normalize both novice and experienced meditators, because as you can see, it seems that their connectivity patterns at least are different even at baseline. And what we can do then is ask them after each run to correlate their subjective experience with their brain activity patterns, so we can start to link the subjective and their objective brain activity, whether it's increased self-related activation or decreased activation. In this case, we give them a meditation condition. Novices, probably some of you in the back can't see this, there's about an 8 out of 10 correspondence in the novices, and we found a similar correspondence, about 7.5 in experienced meditators. The thing I like about this is that you don't need a very fancy statistics to tell the difference between these 2 groups. Now, the other thing that folks were getting at earlier today, and I'd like to build on that, is we can actually use this type of technology to start to get at individual variability, not only within subjects, but within a single run within a single subject. So for example, you can see this experienced meditator in his first run was starting to learn to meditate while he's watching his brain activity, while he's laying in an fMRI scan. And we've already heard about context and how important context is. And you can see his first run is very different than his fourth run, and you can even make up a story that it looks like he's learning how to do this. I'm going to give an example of how we can then start to collect these neurophenomenological data and correlate them back with brain activity. So we actually shortened our runs from 3 minutes in our first study to 1 minute, because 3 minutes is hard to go back and remember everything that happened, especially when you're not supposed to be thinking about remembering what you're doing. So this is an experienced meditator that said, at the beginning I caught myself, I was trying to guess when the words were going to end, this was the active baseline, and when the meditation was going to begin. So I was trying to be like, okay, ready, set, go, and then there was an additional word that popped up, and I was like, oh shit, and there's this red spike you see there. And then I sort of immediately settled in, and I was really getting into it. And then I thought, oh my gosh, this is amazing, it's doing exactly what I'm saying. And then you see this red spike. Okay? So this experience of, think back to all those other studies, kind of getting caught up in something. And then I was like, okay, don't get distracted, and I got back into it, and it got blue again. I was like, oh my gosh, this is unbelievable. It's doing exactly what my mind's doing. So he was laughing at this point. He said, so I find it really funny because to the next question, that's a perfect map of what my mind was going through. So we can actually ask the question, well, I wasn't sure exactly what his mind was going through because he was just describing this in very superficial terms. But when we collect data from a bunch of subjects, we can start to use this first-person self-report to better understand these cognitive processes. For example, the brain activity as it increases or decreases in the posterior cingulate cortex. And then we can use methods like grounded theory to do qualitative analysis of these self-report data and link them to brain activity. For those of you that aren't familiar with this technique, this is something that I had to learn, and we did this in collaboration with a group at Brown. Was basically, there was a very patient undergraduate who took all of these subjective self-reports and put them into open code. And so anytime somebody was mentioned remembering or thinking about a place or being calm, that went into those boxes, which then get congealed into central codes and then into larger theoretical codes. And then we can line these up in a blinded manner with brain activity. So for example, I'm just showing a heuristic with the activation of the posterior cingulate cortex. What you can see here is there were, for example, 64 instances when somebody reported being distracted and their posterior cingulate was activated. Well, this is nice because it replicates a lot of previous data showing that when people are distracted, that their posterior cingulate is activated. What we also found that we weren't expecting was this whole category that came out around controlling, or at least this is the way they coded it. Controlling, so when they were efforting, when they were discontent, this also activated the posterior, this was correlated with an activation of the posterior cingulate cortex. So we can start to get a little more granular in terms of what subjective experience and different types of subjective experience line up with the exact same brain region getting activated. So I'll just show an example of this. So this person reported that this was halfway through the graph. I worried I wasn't using the graph as an object of meditation, so I tried to look at it harder, somehow pay attention more. So again, this highlights how we can link up, for example, the keywords of trying and increases in posterior cingulate activation. And this can also start to help us break down these areas of, what type of attention are we talking about? Because this person was paying attention, but they were doing it in a particular way, which was, the way they described it in terms of trying. And so this would fall into the category of efforting. In contrast to this, we see deactivation in the posterior cingulate correlating with undistracted awareness, a lot of reports of concentration, again replicating a lot of previous literature, which is nice to see. You can even think of this as a positive control. Great, thank you. In contra, and kind of similar to the efforting, we found a whole other category where people were reporting not efforting, and this actually corresponded to decreases in the posterior cingulate activity. So this isn't necessarily, this might suggest that the posterior cingulate isn't necessarily always related to paying attention, but it's the quality of the attention or the quality of our experience that this may relate more to. I'm just going to show some examples. So the first one said that toward the middle I had some thoughts, which I don't see on the graph, maybe because I let them flow by. Second one, I noticed the more I relaxed and stopped trying to do anything, the bluer it went. Now I understand what Yoda was talking about. So if we bring this back, and I'll just close here, if we bring this back to our heuristic models of our heuristic models related to psychological processes, if you think about this again in a simplistic way, but a way that we can start to develop hypotheses that we can test, craving sure is central to this model, but what is it about craving that's important here when we start to link this to brain activity? If you look at the posterior cingulate cortex, it might be this idea of getting caught up in the craving or getting carried along. That's more important than the craving itself. It's how we relate to the craving, which also relates directly back to these central tenets of mindfulness. It's our relationship to the process. It's to the contents, for example, rather than the contents themselves. Now, and I'm not endorsing or not endorsing, I'm not going to say anything about grains or causal models, because I'm sure many people have different opinions about those. But it's interesting when we start to look at the connectivity and network analyses here, it's been people have suggested, I'll say, that when you look at these different networks, for example, the dorsal anterior cingulate and the posterior cingulate, when they start to interact, you can see a correlation between when there's and the way that this was described in this paper, as the dorsal anterior cingulate kind of suppressing the posterior cingulate, you see behavior gets enhanced, and they saw a nice correlation with a cognitive performance test. And in contrast, when the posterior cingulate was acting on the dorsal anterior cingulate, there was a degradation of behavior. So from all of these data that we're seeing in our clinical data, this may suggest, or at least provides a workable hypothesis that we can test around these monitoring functions coming in during when people are learning mindfulness training, to come and see what it's like when we get caught up in our experience, and not necessarily say don't do that anymore, but just notice what it's like. Just like our smoker reported, oh, this isn't as good as I thought it was. And when they see what they're actually getting from it, they may naturally start to let go, as compared to other types of cognitive training processes. And you can also see, if we can start to tease out the different mechanistic differences between, for example, mindfulness training and cognitive therapy, we can see how these might fit together. And there are already a lot of therapies that are being developed. Mindfulness-based cognitive therapy, for one, has been shown to have really good efficacy for prevention of relapse to depression. And so I think the next steps that we can all take together is start to really bring together what we're finding neurobiologically with what we're finding cognitively with these psychological models, to see how they all fit in a way that will actually help improve treatment. So I'll just stop there and say there are a ton of people that went into this work as well, but mostly I'm going to thank our subjects first and foremost, because without them we wouldn't be able to report any of these data. So I will stop there, and we can move on to the next speaker.
Okay. Thank you so much, Judd.